Dennis Van Roekel, president of the nation's largest union, the National Education Association, and Thea Lee of the AFL-CIO. All right now on Fox News Sunday. Up next, we'll sit down with two top union officials to get their take on what happened this week and what it means for big labor. Now, we want to hear from the other side of the Wisconsin recall fight, organized labor. Joining us are two key officials, Dennis Van Roekel, president of the National Education Association, the country's largest union, and Thea Lee, deputy chief of staff and a leading policy voice at the AFL-CIO, the federation that represents more than 12 million workers. And welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Let's start with a question I asked Governor Daniels. When you look at the recall vote in Wisconsin, as well as the vote in those two California cities to cut back on government worker pensions, what's the message, Mr. Van Roekel?
I think one thing we overlook is the change in the Senate. It's a balance of power now. I think that's very important. Governor Walker retained.
You're talking about in Wisconsin?
Yes, in Wisconsin. I think that's very important. The second thing, I think it really points out the impact of unlimited corporate funding in elections. And we have to see as this plays out, especially as we move toward the November election.
But Ms. Lee, I mean, do you not think that there was a message from voters that at a time when states and local governments owe more than $1 trillion to public pension and health care funds, that at least some private voters, non-public workers, are saying the government workers we pay with our taxes must tighten their belts?
Well, these are definitely tough times economically. I think everybody's looking around to figure out how are we going to balance our budgets, and that's something that unions and management and governments all have to come together to figure out. But I think at the end of the day, we really need to look at the big picture, which is in this country, should workers, whether they're in the public or the private sector, have a decent pension, have a secure retirement, and that's something that people do support at the end of the day. We have to figure out how to fund it. We have to figure out how to make it viable. But I don't think that voters in this country want to go to a place where our elderly people are living in poverty, are struggling, and so on. So I think it's tough times, and when times are tough, people are trying to figure out who's to blame. But we need to be able to fund our public sector in a way that allows everybody to have a decent
All right. Well, let's look at a comparison that we've put together of what public workers get and what private workers get. And let's put it up on the screen. 64% of private workers have access to pensions. 90% of state and local government workers do. 69% of private workers have access to health insurance. 87% of public workers do. And private workers average $8.53 in benefits per hour worked. Public workers get $14.31 in benefits per hour worked. Ms. Lee, why should people in the private sector be paying their taxes so that government workers get more than they do?
Well, I think we have to turn the question around. It's not so much why do some people have a pension and others not? How do we take away the pension from the people who have it? That's un-American. I mean, I think we need to figure out how do we make sure that everybody in America has a decent pension. This is a wealthy country.
But would you agree with those figures that show that more public workers have access to pensions, more public workers have access to health care, and that they're getting more per hour worked in terms of benefits than private workers?
Well, I think the balance of benefits versus wages in the public sector is a little bit different, but if you look at overall the big picture between public sector workers and private sector workers, if you compare them according to education and experience and the job category, in fact, public sector workers are not overpaid, even taking benefits into account.
That may work for salary. It doesn't work for benefits.
No, that's when you take salary and benefits.
Well, I'm asking about just benefits, though, which is considerably more, $14 an hour versus $8 an hour.
But some public sector workers have chosen to take some of their compensation in the form of benefits as opposed to wages. They're not overpaid on average. In fact, especially at the top end where you have doctors and lawyers and accountants and professionals in the public sector, they're earning less than their private sector counterparts, even taking into account the benefits.
Mr. Van Roekel, can you understand where some people in the private sector would sit there and say, wait a minute, I don't get these benefits, and then I have to pay taxes so the public workers get benefits that I don't get?
One of the things that's left out of that equation, first of all, in the comparison of wages of private versus public, are the qualification and education needed for those jobs. So,
well, yes, but having said that, there are people, for instance, in your group, teachers, they get a degree so they can teach, which wouldn't be very marketable in the rest of the world.
And the other part about the pension is we need to understand that the employees are also paying into that pension. So in cases like in California where they want to take away from people who are already retired, they paid in every single paycheck into their pension. Government didn't live up to their end. Poor management on the part of government for managing their pension funds denied now the benefits. In the private sector, the same thing happened. United absolutely blew their pension system. Workers got pennies on the dollars. And who had to bail out the private company who didn't manage their pension system well? The U.S. government. So if you have a responsibility as management and employee, we pay in, we expect our employers to pay their share so that the system works.
Let's look at the exit polls from Wisconsin this week, which are instructive. Among people who live in union households, private union households, 62% voted for Tom Barrett, but 37%, more than a third, back Governor Walker, who instituted these labor reforms. Mr. Van Roekel, we've seen this in other states. New Jersey, for example, a lot of people who back private unions think that government workers are getting too much.
I think that's part of the divide and conquer. The reason they went after public sector unions and left some private sector alone is part of a thing to try and drive a wedge between people. I also understand that unions are not monolithic, but I also understand that when you're outspent 7-1, that 68% of all the people saw more ads for Walker than Barrett. I understand that their message from the corporate side has been heard better than the one from the common everyday worker.
This was the big issue in Wisconsin for more than a year. You don't think that the vast majority of voters, certainly you're right, that the Walker side had more money and more ads, that the vast majority of people, the exit polls showed that the vast majority had made up their minds more than a month before the election. They knew what the issues were here.
One of the big differences between Wisconsin and Ohio, in Ohio, the policy of taking bargaining rights, the voice, just the ability to get fairness from the employer at the table, that was voted down by the citizens 2-1.
But that was private unions.
No, it was public sector.
It was
public sector, but it was on a policy question. In Wisconsin, it was a recall, which is very different. 60% of the exit poll people said that they didn't believe recall should be used to oust someone just on political belief. So that was a difficult hurdle to overcome, even from day one.
But one of the big questions, Ms. Lee, is what government should spend its limited resources on? Benefits for workers, or services for all of us, for people. And let me give you an example. In Wisconsin, pension reform will save schools $600 million over 2 years. In the New Berlin School District in Wisconsin, to take one example, they're using those savings to hire more staff, reduce class size, and add programs. What's more important? And I ask this of both of you. Actually, let me start specifically because it involves schools with you, Mr. Van Roekel. What's more important to the NEA? Protecting the benefits of teachers or giving services to the students?
In Wisconsin, it was never about the economy. It was always a political decision. The unions did agree to pay more in pensions and health care in Wisconsin. But Governor Walker, even though he accepted that, he didn't end there. It was a political game. He wanted
but the fact is they did save money, and as a result, they're giving more to the students.
We advocate for both students and the employees. You can't have one without the other. The success of every single student in America depends on that they are well-qualified, well-trained, and hopefully well-compensated individuals who are delivering that education.
Ms. Lee.
I think it's a false choice between good services and decent pay and pensions for workers. And Governor Walker, when he came into office, he didn't have a budget problem. He gave a big tax cut to the wealthy and to corporations. That created the budget pressures where you end up having to pit quality against pay. So you actually can have both. And I think unions are totally supportive, as Dennis Van Roekel has said, of supporting good schools, good services, and then also making sure that workers are taken care of.
But there's just not enough money to go around, Ms. Lee. Let me give you an example. Look at San Jose, California, where the Democratic mayor of that city says that the cut that was instituted on Tuesday to public worker pensions means that they are no longer going to have to close firehouses some of the time because they didn't have the money to keep them all open all the time. He says it'll give them the money so that they can actually open the 4 libraries that they had built but didn't have the money to operate. So here you got the Democratic mayor of San Jose saying it's not a false choice. It's one or the other.
But in education in particular, if you think about what the challenges the United States is facing, that we need to be competitive in a global economy. We need to attract really great people into the teaching profession. We're not going to do that if we keep chipping away at their pensions and at their pay and at their job security and so on. So I think the other thing you need to think about is how do you get the best people into public service? You're not going to do that by constantly cutting away at wages and benefits.
Forgive me, though, but you're not answering my question, which is, in San Jose, the Democratic mayor says, look, we have a choice. We can let these people keep the pensions that they have, or we can open the firehouses and open the libraries.
Or they could find some revenues. And
where are you going to get those?
Well, you can... right now, we've seen at the very top of the tax scale that the wealthiest Americans are paying less in taxes than they did 10, 20 years ago. And so that's one place. We have different kinds of user fees or taxes on corporations that
so
we've
raise
been
taxes.
cutting. We could raise taxes. We absolutely could raise taxes, and we ought to raise taxes if we need to do that to provide the social services that Americans need and depend on, and to make sure that we are attracting the very best people into public service.
Ms. Lee, how disappointed are you that Barack Obama didn't show up to campaign in Wisconsin?
That's a decision for President Obama, and I think the people of Wisconsin, the workers of Wisconsin, the families of Wisconsin worked hard. They led this campaign. They showed a tremendous amount of energy and solidarity. They gathered a million signatures.
With all this effort, and there was a tremendous effort, the fact that the president, I mean, come on, you must have a feeling about it.
I'm not going to second guess the president.
Okay. Mr. Van Roekel, let me look at it from another aspect. Is it possible for Mr. Romney to oppose the growth of government and not to be the enemy of public workers?
You know, I was a high school math teacher for 23 years, and his math just doesn't add up. I mean, when he said that we need to have less firemen, less police, and less teachers, and that we ought to invest in people, I don't understand that math at all. I think it is the firemen, the policemen, and teachers who are delivering to the American public. They're the ones who are bringing this incredible service to kids, preparing the next generation, and he says what we ought to do is build wealth. There's a difference between building wealth in a very small group of people than doing it for the nation. You know, in the last 29 years, productivity up 80%, hourly wages up 8%. The lowest 1/5, their wages up 18%. But the top 1%, their wages go up 275%. We have got to find a way to lift all citizens, not just a few, not a 1%, not just the wealthy few.
We're going to have to leave it there. Mr. Van Roekel, Ms. Lee, thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thank
you.
Up next, our Sunday panel.